As we get ready to open the Word together today, I want to show you a picture that came actually from Australia just recently. Take a look at this. So just take a moment to process. Do you see the little feet there, or big feet, medium-sized feet? What this is a picture that is from the top of this break in the rocks looking down. So where those feet are, if like this was a break in the rocks, the feet would be right there. And this poor lady, what happened is she was climbing the rocks with some friends in Australia, and she dropped her cell phone. And I'm trying to picture how this happened. She went after the cell phone, somehow diving head first into the rock crevice, and she got stuck there. And those are her feet. Those are her shoes also. So for about an hour, this woman's friends, they tried to get her free from out of the rocks and couldn't do it. So they called in for professional help, and rescuers came, and she was upside down for 7 hours, head down, feet up for 7 hours. Rescuers were able to get her free, and after all that, she only had a few minor scrapes and bruises, so she's going to be fine. All right, so here is the question, knowing that she's going to be okay. How many of you think they got the cell phone? How many of you think the cell phone is gone forever? Cell phone is gone forever. So after all that, she still has to go to T-Mobile and get a new phone. Lesson learned. Just let the phone go. Make sure your pictures are saved in the cloud, right? That's good. So when I saw this picture, I thought, most of us, we will never be trapped like that. We'll never be trapped or stuck in that way, but most of us, many or even all of us, we understand the feeling of being stuck. We understand the feeling of being trapped in a life situation. And if that's you or it's been you, then you might use words like frustration or fear or helplessness. And it could be that there are responsibilities or expectations or past choices that you carry in today, and it seems like no matter how hard you try, no matter what you try, you make little or no progress. If there is a solution, it's not easy to you. So you'd say, I feel stuck or I feel trapped. Now, as I am a pastor, when I saw this picture, I also thought, you know what? This actually, it seems to be how a lot of pastors are feeling in this year's election cycle. And not just pastors probably, maybe some of us who are Jesus followers, that we feel trapped or stuck. And here's what I mean by that. Pressing on one side, this election that we're in right now is raising a lot of issues that are not just political, they're not just cultural, but they are biblical. And we see on the pages of the Bible, Old Testament prophets, people in the New Testament like Paul, certainly Jesus, speaking up against cultural issues, even when it's totally against popular opinion. God spoke through the prophet Isaiah 58:1. Listen to this. Shout it aloud. Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. Like call out in culture what is opposed to God. So pressing on one side is this call from the Word of God to speak truth. And then on the other side, sometimes, have you been in a room where it's like you are either confident or fairly confident that everyone in the room agrees with you? We tend to talk differently in those rooms than if we know that there are people in the room who have different views. And when we're in a setting like this, we know that there are people that have all sorts of different views and backgrounds and thoughts and beliefs and perceptions of the world that are gathered in this room. So on the other side, that's one pressure. On the other side is this pressure. What if someone is here today and it's the very first time they've ever walked through the doors of the church? Maybe that's you. Maybe there's someone here today and you're desperate. You feel like you're searching. You're wondering, is there any hope? You're wondering, have I walked into these doors, and is it possible that the answer to what I'm going through can be found as I gather with these people here today? We're thankful that we have so many freedoms in this country, but this other pressure is that we don't want to live out these freedoms in a way that become an obstacle toward people who are trying to find faith in Christ. So there's these two pressures, and feeling these two pressures, it's possible to say, well, I'm just going to opt out completely. Or I'm going to opt out of one side, or I'm going to opt out of the other. I'm going to opt out of speaking out against what I know in culture is at odds with God, or I'm just going to opt out of reaching across barriers and speaking to people who disagree with me. And some of us, if we're honest, we might say it's been a long time since I've had a conversation or relationship with someone who views the world differently than I do. So instead of opting out, some of you might feel today, I just wish that, like the lady in the rock, I wish that someone would just come and rescue me and just extract me and put me in a different situation. I want you to hear today, the church is not backed in a corner right now. Jesus is not backed in a corner because of the election. The Bible is just as relevant today as it has ever been. And come on, church, we live in a culture that thrives and feeds on outrage and division. Social media and cable news feed on outrage and division. And what I want us to see today is I believe that Jesus gives us a better way. It can be we're going to see it's going to be a more challenging way, but a better way. And church, we cannot simply relegate the difficult conversations to the politicians. Sometimes we feel like, oh, good, the politicians who I agree with, they're talking about this, so I don't have to talk about it. We can't just leave the conversations up to the world of politics. God's given the church to be a voice into what's happening in culture. And so, this morning we're going to open up to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. If you've been along with us for a while, you know that this entire year we have been working our way through the gospel as recorded by Mark. There are 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have been working our way through the gospel as recorded by Mark. We have actually covered almost the entire book of Mark except for 2 chapters, Mark 9 and Mark 10, and we're going to take care of that this week and next week. Today we're going to look at a situation where Jesus' disciples are arguing. Don't raise your hand, but how many of you have had an argument this week? Some of you couldn't resist. You just went ahead and raised your hand anyway. So Jesus' disciples are arguing. We're going to see what happens when Jesus gets involved, and we're going to talk about how this speaks into a culture that has become very much us versus them. Us versus them. And I'm not just talking about the church versus culture. I'm saying that everybody, or a lot of people, seem to be living in an us versus them mindset right now, meaning that you surround yourself with people who agree with you. That becomes your us, and you view the people who don't agree with you as the them. A united culture breaks down and becomes a divided culture. But a divided culture, don't miss this, a divided culture can collapse even further and become a polarized culture. Someone say polarized. When I say polarized, what's the difference between a polarized culture and a divided culture? In a polarized culture, a person will not agree with someone on the other side, even if the other side has a good point. Even if there's some value on what's happening on the other side. In a polarized culture, I have to disagree with you because there's no way we can be on the same page. And what's wild is that founding father James Madison actually wrote about this more than 200 years ago. And when I read this quote from James Madison, it's as if it were written today. This is James Madison, 1787. Complaints are everywhere. Sound familiar? Complaints are everywhere, equally the friends of public and private faith, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Our country has become so polarized that one survey suggests that because of this polarization, we are on the verge of a national mental health crisis. American Psychological Association released its survey, Stress in America, just recently, and found that more than 7 in 10 adults said the future of the nation is a significant source of stress in their lives. With the economy and the 2024 presidential election following closely behind. Do you see that statistic that about 70% of Americans say that the presidential election is causing them significant stress? And again, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but maybe you would walk in today and I would say, how are you doing today? You might say, man, I am stressed. I am stressed because not necessarily something that's happening in my individual life, but because of what I see happening in our nation today. Now, because of that, as a result, you may resonate with the focus group that was interviewed by the Pew Research Center. According to this release from Pew Research Center, in a fractious political environment, often dominated by the loudest voices on the left and right, some people are saying, count us out. They don't closely follow news about politics or government, though some feel guilty when they don't. By and large, this group, they look at the nation's politics as a topic better to be avoided than embraced. So what does the Bible have to say about this? What does Jesus have to say about all this? Mark chapter 9. What I want us to see today is that if people who walked, talked, and lived life with Jesus for 3 years got into arguments, if people who walked, talked, and lived with Jesus for 3 years got in arguments that they didn't even want Jesus to know about, if it's possible for them to go down that road, it's possible for all of us. So take a look at this. Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 37, and then I'm also going to read verse 42. I'm going to read it out loud. I encourage you to read it in your word if you brought it today, and I always encourage you to take some notes. So Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse 33, they came to Capernaum when Jesus was in the house. He asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? Come on, church. Sometimes I think Jesus looks at us and it's like, what are you arguing about? What are you arguing about? So this is what happens in this situation. They kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. He took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Skipping down to verse 42. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. Jesus covers a lot of ground in a short amount of time. So the disciples are arguing. They're arguing about who's going to get their way. They're arguing about whose idea is the best idea. So they're arguing, and they must know that whatever they're arguing about is not God-honoring. Because as soon as Jesus asks them, what are you arguing about? They don't want to say. But Jesus knows, and Jesus takes an argument about who's going to get their way, and he redirects the disciples into a conversation about serving others. He doesn't referee the argument. He doesn't say, well, you're more right than you are. He doesn't say you're all right or you're all wrong. He redirects the conversation completely to a conversation about being a servant. And then there's one more piece that you have to catch this. You have to catch this. Jesus makes statements about children that if you understand the culture of the day were actually quite controversial and quite confronting to the culture. Here's what I mean. In Jesus' time, children had super low status in society. No status, no influence, no wealth. So for Jesus to elevate a child is to go down to the bottom level, the bottom rung on the ladder of society, and elevate someone who has no power, no influence, nothing that they can give back to you in return. And Jesus says we need to look at the world through the lens of these children. By elevating children to a place of honor, Jesus challenges the view of culture. He reverses the view of culture. By elevating children, Jesus challenges the social structure that placed so much importance on wealth, on power, and influence. And when we hear that, we think not much has changed. For Jesus to elevate children in this way, think about this. It may have offended, in this room, Jesus is talking to his disciples. But if he were talking to a room that's more like this, where we have people of all different backgrounds and thoughts and beliefs, if he was talking to a larger crowd, if he were to pull the child over and talk about this in front of all these people, there would be some who were so offended they may walk off. As one theologian puts it, children and women were largely auxiliary members of society whose connection to the social mainstream depended on men, either their husbands or fathers. So, don't miss this. What we see in this moment, Jesus does two things simultaneously, and Jesus makes it look easy. Jesus teaches his followers to be servants, and he confronts culture. He teaches his followers to be servants, and he confronts culture. From what happens with Jesus in this moment, what we see is that to be a servant doesn't mean just going along to get along. Being a servant doesn't mean avoiding conflict. Being a servant doesn't mean just to passively let things go by. Maybe you've been there. Maybe it's felt like you're in a situation of opposing views, opposing thoughts, and it's easier just to not say anything. Maybe you've even convinced yourself, it's just more loving for me not to say anything at all. But look at what Paul writes to the church in Corinth after the death and resurrection of Jesus as the early church is starting and growing, 1 Corinthians 13:6. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. So think of this in light of the thought line that we might convince ourselves, well, it's just more loving for me not to say anything. No, Paul writes to the church in Corinth, love does not delight in evil, but actually rejoices with the truth. So it really gets to our motive. So much of Jesus' interaction with people is all about the motive. Not what's going on the surface, but what's going on in the heart. And if our motive stops at winning the argument, if our motive only goes as far as winning the election, passing laws we agree with, getting rid of laws that we don't agree with, if that is the end of our motive, I believe we come up empty. Look how Paul puts it in a letter to the church in Ephesus. Ephesians 4:15, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Here is a short phrase, 5 words that are very easy to say, but come on, this is really challenging to live out. Speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. I appreciate what Tim Keller writes about love and truth and what happens if you have one and not the other. So the late Tim Keller, he says that love without truth is sentimentality. I bet you haven't used that word in a sentence this week. Love without truth is sentimentality. And what that word sentimentality means, it means superficial and shallow. It is the desire to comfort without acknowledging the deeper and challenging realities of the situation. So, love without truth is sentimentality. On the other side, truth without love is harshness. It gives us information, but in such a way that we cannot really hear it. Paul challenges the church in Ephesus, and he challenges us today to be people who would strive after speaking truth in love. Jesus, he challenges the culture to elevate the vulnerable. Jesus, he exposes people who were supposed to represent God, but actually were just in it for themselves and were more interested in protecting their own positions and traditions than actually representing God. So Jesus is calling out the culture. And sometimes it's easier for us to look at how Jesus was calling out the culture 2,000 years ago than what's happening in our culture today. So maybe it's just going to get a touch uncomfortable for some people in the room right now, because I'm going to fast forward to 2,000 years later to today and some of the things that are happening in culture today. Right now, there is a struggle for identity in our culture. What is my identity? Where do I fit in? It may feel like there are a lot of voices that are telling you what you should believe, what you're supposed to believe, and maybe these voices that are speaking into your life, that they're conflicting, and you're trying to figure out, do I believe this just because someone told me I believe it, or do I actually believe it? On top of that, add in YouTube influencers, Instagram, TikTok, people who want you to emulate them, and so there is this identity crisis in our country. And one lane of this identity struggle that is happening in our culture, this is not the only thing, but one of these lanes that is happening in this identity struggle is that doctors are diagnosing children and teenagers with gender dysphoria. And if you were to go to an online search right now and to search up gender dysphoria, you would see leading medical websites list options or solutions like puberty blockers, hormone pills, hormone injections, hormone gels and patches, surgeries that cannot be undone. And so talk about the division that we have in our culture today. Some are calling this gender affirming care, while others are saying, no, that's child abuse. As we confront this issue in our culture, the end game cannot be a political win. We value what happens in the State House and in Washington, D.C., but the end game cannot be a political win. The heart behind this has to be, are we going to be people who are protective, both protective and also people who are wise? Now, I know that teenagers in the room, you may not want to hear this, but those of us who are a little older, we would look back at our teenage years and say, you know what? When we were teenagers, our minds were still developing. And so we should not expect teenagers to make decisions that alter their bodies for a lifetime when their minds are still developing without the consultation of their parents. So James, he gives us this great advice. James, in his letter, he says, be quick to listen. See, that's what you were doing. You were listening. Be quick to listen, be slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. It feels like we're often living in the opposite of that, right? That no one wants to listen. Everyone wants to speak and see how many likes can I get? How many thumbs up can I get? And a lot of people seem pretty quick to get angry. So James says, be slow to speak, be quick to listen, and hang on. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. There we go. So, how does this play out in your house? Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. Elections matter. But in your family, what happens in your household matters even more. For your family, how conversations like this, how they are handled in your house, it matters a lot more than what's happening in the White House. Here's what I mean by this. If your children feel shunned or turned away when they come to you and try to talk through the real struggles that they're facing, they will find someone who will listen to them. They will find someone who will listen to them. And it's possible if they don't feel like you will listen to them, they will find someone who will listen to them, and there's no guarantee that whoever they find will view the world the way that you view the world. How this is handled in your house is more important for your family than how this is handled in the White House. I don't know what you've been through today. I don't know what's led you to this moment. I don't know your story, but you need to know that God knows your story. God knows your story. Maybe no one has ever told this to you before. Before you reach the conclusion that a mistake has been made with your biology, before you convince yourself that medically or chemically changing your anatomy is the answer, you need to hear this. You have been made in the image of God. You have been made in the image of God. And what that means, to be made in the image of God, means that you carry attributes that reflect who God is. You carry attributes like your ability to think, to feel, to create, and to love. That is the image of God that has been placed on you. You are, again, maybe no one has ever told this to you before, you are loved by God. You are loved by God. Maybe someone has even told you that you are a mistake. No, God has not made a mistake. You are loved by God. In fact, the word says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You were crafted not in a mass production, but you were fearfully and wonderfully made intentionally. You are unique. There is no one else exactly like you. You are valued and you are known by God, yes, in the way that you look, but also in your deepest thoughts and feelings and desires. God knows you. So, Jesus teaches his followers to be both servants and those who would confront culture. And because we're just going after it today, I also am going to say this. Unplanned pregnancies are nothing new. In fact, in the pages of the Bible thousands of years ago, a pregnancy was not the desired outcome when King David called for the wife of a military officer to come over to his home. Yet a pregnancy was the result. Unplanned pregnancies are not new to humanity. Yet if this is something that you're going through right now, it may feel like a crisis. You may even go as far as saying this is not just unplanned, it is unwanted. This is not what you anticipated when you envisioned school or career. This is not how you saw it all playing out. What about your goals? What about your plans? It seems like you don't have any support or enough support. What about all the other relationships that now seem to be hanging in the balance? Because of this, there are some who say that, well, the best that we can do is make sure that there is easy, unrestricted access to abortions. That's the best that we can do for our culture. And church, I know this makes some of us uncomfortable to even bring it up, but you need to know, if you don't know, that there are multiple states that right now in this election cycle have abortion measures on their ballot that will forever change constitutions if they're passed. Some are seeking to enshrine the right to an abortion in their state's constitutions through all 9 months of pregnancy. And we're here to simply say we believe that there is a better way. And as we're talking about this and getting to, it's not just about a political win, it's not just about us winning or this side winning and this side losing. It's about motive. It's about motive. And when it comes to motive, I think of this story that was told at this gathering for Hope Pregnancy Clinic earlier this month. I know that a lot of you were there with me. We heard the story of a teenager who became pregnant. The young man involved wasn't ready or did not want to be a dad. The young woman's mom, perhaps believing that let's just make this go away, she made an appointment and planned to drive her teenage daughter to an abortion provider. This young woman on her own went to Hope Pregnancy Clinic. She saw an ultrasound and was presented with options for support if she would decide to move forward with the pregnancy. She walked out the door. After all that, the teenager's mom still drove her to the abortion provider. She went into the procedure room. And remember I said that we can live in a place where it feels like everyone is telling us what we're supposed to think, what we're supposed to do. This is best for you. This is what you need to believe. This is what you need to do. Right before the procedure began, as it was told that night by the Hope Pregnancy Clinic worker, that young woman found her voice. And before the procedure began, she said, "This is not what I want to do. I don't want to have this procedure today." And several months later, that teenager was back at Hope Pregnancy Clinic to receive parenting classes to become a young mom. And we were also told that even the mom's mom, that she had a change of heart and began to prepare for life as a young grandmother. 1 Corinthians 13:6, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. See, we can think, I want to be a servant, I want to put people's needs above my own. I'm so thankful that in this moment from history that is recorded for us in Mark, Jesus says, what are you arguing about? Be a servant. But if we stop reading there, we miss out on how Jesus talks about children in a way that totally challenges culture. So in this, we see an example that to just remain silent in the face of what many of us would consider evil is actually not loving. Valuing someone above yourself does not mean that you have to affirm values that contradict God's word. It may be more convenient to remain silent, but affirming evil is not compassionate. I think we've been pretty clear that we value the privilege of voting. If you're thinking that you heard me tell you who to vote for today, I didn't. Go back and check the recording. I have not and will not tell you how to vote. That is between you and God. We have provided voter guides that tell you where the candidates stand on different issues that you can take for free today in the lobby. We have an election group that this year is providing a box in our lobby where you can drop off your ballots. I wasn't quite sure how that would go, yet every time I'm in the lobby, I see someone putting their ballot in there. And every week after Sunday morning gatherings and after Wednesday evening gatherings, those ballots are securely taken to the county clerk. We have people who are here today, people who are in our church family who are running for office. And I just want to say thank you. You know who you are. I want to say thank you because it is a big step. It's a big step that few of us know, to put your name out there on a ballot to be scrutinized by the public. So thank you for those of you who are seeking office in this election. We said in the beginning, there's times when those of us who are Jesus followers, we're thankful that the politician is talking about it because it feels like, oh, they're talking about it, so that means I don't have to talk about it. But I think some of the politicians in the room would look at us and say, okay, where's the church? Where's the church? There are candidates and parties that better reflect biblical views, but you need to hear this today. God is certainly not confined to a political party. I gave you the statistic that about 7 in 10 Americans are really, really stressed right now about the presidential election. And it's as if the message is, if my candidate doesn't win, I'm going to lose it. If my party does not succeed, if my party does not take the majority, if my party misses out on preventing a supermajority, I'm going to lose it. I'm going to have a mental health crisis. Well, we believe in elections. Come on, church. Our hope is not in the election. Our hope is not in the election. Our hope is not if this person becomes president or that person becomes president. Our hope is in the one who is already the king. In a culture that is so divided, may people see something different in the church. This is a moment where the church has an opportunity to show the world that people who follow Jesus are different. The church is not here to be in charge. It's to represent the one who is in charge, who's Jesus, by the way. You know, if we were to go back to the time when Jesus walked the earth, or if we were to go back to the time after the death and resurrection of Jesus, when the Roman Empire was as strong as an empire has ever been, and there was this little fledgling movement of Jesus followers that actually they became known as Christians, and when the term Christian was first used, it wasn't an affectionate term, it was a derogatory term, the Christians. If we were to be able to get in a DeLorean, from my Back to the Future folks, if we were to be able to get in a DeLorean time machine and go back to those days, and we were to say to the people then, you know what? There will be a time when the Roman Empire will collapse and will no longer exist in a way that's even close to this. The Roman Empire will collapse, but this little movement of Jesus followers, that will be a global movement. They would have thought you were crazy. Even the Christians probably would have thought you were crazy. But do you know what? That's exactly what happened. The Roman Empire collapsed, but the gospel survived. The Roman Empire collapsed, but the kingdom of God is alive and well. Even if you get to live to be 100 years or a few more than 100 years old, we only get to experience a very narrow bracket in the great timeline of world history. And we have to remember, God sees a timeline that started long before us, and if Jesus should tarry in his return, long after us. God sees a timeline that is so much longer than our lifetime. Most of us, we cannot imagine a world without America. And I'm thankful that we have this country where we have the freedom to worship. I'm thankful that we live in a country where we have the freedom to worship. But here's the thing, even if it got so terrible that America collapsed, do you know what? The gospel would survive and the kingdom of God would continue to be alive and well.